Imagine this for a moment. Two of the most powerful men on earth are seated across from each other at an enormous table in Beijing. One leads the world's largest standing military force and controls the second largest economy on the planet. The other commands the biggest nuclear arsenal in existence and presides over a nation battered by war, sanctions, and mounting financial strain. They smile for the cameras, they raise glasses, they sign agreements. The optics are flawless. To the outside world, it looks like the ultimate show of unity, the image of an ironclad geopolitical alliance standing strong against the West. But behind that carefully staged moment, behind the polished diplomacy and the public declarations of eternal partnership, something far more complicated is unfolding. Because this relationship, this so-called strategic partnership that both Moscow and Beijing have praised as stronger than any political or military alliance from the Cold War, is not as solid as it appears. It is beginning to show fractures, not through dramatic speeches, public betrayals, or open hostility, but through something much more revealing. Through energy deals, through trade numbers, through intelligence reports, through pipeline negotiations, through cyber espionage, and through the kind of strategic silence that often says more than words ever can. Today on Daily Brief, we are diving deep into one of the most important and dangerous geopolitical relationships on Earth. We are talking about Russia and China. We are going to trace this story from its historical roots all the way to the present moment, break down the economic dependency, the military coordination, the political theater, and the hidden tensions, and show you exactly why this partnership may be far more fragile than it looks in 2025. Because on the surface, Beijing and Moscow still project unity. But once you start studying the trade data, the gas pipeline disputes, the intelligence leaks, the internal security concerns, and the strategic competition behind the scenes, a very different reality starts to emerge. And make no mistake, this is not just a story about whether two countries are getting along. This is about the future balance of global power. This is about energy, sanctions, war, influence, territory, technology, and who shapes the world order in the decades ahead. So stay with us, because this is one of those stories where every detail matters. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Daily Brief right now and turn on notifications, because this kind of deep geopolitical analysis is exactly what we do here. Let's begin. To understand where Russia and China stand today, we have to go back, because these two powers were not always close. In fact, for a major part of the 20th century, they were barely on speaking terms and at times came dangerously close to outright conflict. Both were communist powers, both opposed the Western-led order, and both claimed to stand for revolutionary international change. But ideology did not keep them united. In reality, the Soviet Union and Communist China became bitter rivals. During the 1960s, they competed fiercely for control of the global communist movement. They backed rival factions around the world. They used propaganda to attack each other. In several countries, there were even two separate communist parties, one aligned with Moscow and the other aligned with Beijing, actively working against one another. Then, in 1969, the hostility turned into direct violence. A prolonged border clash erupted along the Ussuri River over a disputed frozen island. Chinese and Soviet troops exchanged fire. Men were killed. Tensions escalated so seriously that the two powers were suddenly confronting each other not as ideological brothers, but as strategic enemies. That bitterness did not disappear quickly. It lingered for years and shaped how both capitals viewed one another. The real thaw only came after the collapse of the Soviet Union. A weakened post-Soviet Russia, far less ideologically rigid and far more pragmatic, began repairing ties with its neighbors. Over time, the border disputes were settled, diplomatic ties improved, and a new strategic framework emerged. Then came one of the most important milestones in the relationship. On July 16, 2001, in Moscow, Vladimir Putin and Jiang Zemin signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. On paper, it looked like a broad diplomatic agreement covering economics, regional security, diplomacy, and political coordination. But one part of that treaty stood out above all. Article 9 stated that if either side believed peace was being threatened or its security interests were under threat, both countries would immediately hold consultations to eliminate those threats. Read between the lines and the meaning becomes clear. It was not a formal NATO-style military alliance, but it was far more than symbolic friendship. It created a mutual consultation mechanism that effectively brought the two countries closer to a strategic security understanding. The agreement also included intelligence cooperation and a no-first-use nuclear understanding between them. That treaty was later renewed in 2021, and it remains in effect today. Now, here is where things become even more serious. According to multiple senior Western intelligence assessments, China's leadership was aware of Russia's plan to invade Ukraine before the full-scale assault began. Reports suggested that as a personal favor to Xi Jinping, Putin delayed the invasion until after the Beijing Winter Olympics concluded on February 20th, 2022. Just 4 days later, Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border. Think about what that implies. This was not a casual or temporary partnership. This was the kind of coordination that only happens when two leadership circles are operating with deep trust and clear strategic communication. One leader delayed the start of a major war to protect the other leader's global political showcase. That is not ordinary diplomacy. That is an extraordinary level of strategic alignment. So with all of that in mind, why are we talking about cracks in the relationship at all? Because the relationship rests on powerful foundations, yes, but those foundations are now under pressure. Before we get into that, if you value serious geopolitical deep dives like this one, hit the like button, share this video with someone who follows global politics, and subscribe to Daily Brief so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's break down the structure of the Russia-China partnership. It rests on three main pillars. The first is shared opposition to the West, especially the United States. The second is economic interdependence, particularly in energy, trade, and sanctions survival. And the third is the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. All three matter, all three are real, and all three are now being tested. Start with the first pillar, shared resentment toward the Western order. Both Russia and China see the United States as the primary obstacle to their long-term ambitions. Putin wants Russia restored as a dominant power capable of reshaping the post-Cold War order and reversing what he once described as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. China, meanwhile, wants to reclaim what it sees as its rightful place as the dominant power in Asia and eventually a central power globally. Both see American-led alliances, institutions, and financial systems as barriers to those goals. NATO, the U.S. dollar system, the IMF structure, the liberal rules-based order, all of these are viewed in Moscow and Beijing not as neutral systems, but as instruments of Western influence. China's distrust of Western military power has a deeply emotional and strategic source as well. One of the most enduring grievances in Beijing's memory is NATO's bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade on May 7, 1999, during the Kosovo conflict. 3 Chinese journalists were killed and many embassy staff were injured. NATO called it an accident. China never fully accepted that explanation. That single event permanently shaped how Beijing viewed NATO and Western military credibility. It remains part of the political memory that fuels China's suspicion of Western intentions to this day. So yes, at the level of strategic worldview, Russia and China are aligned. They both oppose a U.S.-dominated global order. They both want more space to project power. And that shared adversary has helped hold the relationship together even when other tensions have been growing underneath the surface. Then comes the second pillar, economics. And this is where the relationship becomes both stronger and more unstable at the same time. The trade growth between Russia and China has been staggering. In 2001, when the Friendship Treaty was first signed, bilateral trade was only around $10 billion a year. By 2018, that number had climbed to $100 billion. By 2024, two-way trade had reportedly reached a record $245 billion. Russia overtook Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier. China overtook Germany as Russia's biggest trading partner. After the Ukraine war triggered sanctions and economic isolation for Moscow, China became not just an important partner, but a critical economic lifeline. And that dependence deepened sharply after 2022. Once Western sanctions hit, Russia lost much of its access to Europe's energy markets, financial systems, and industrial supply chains. Gas exports to Europe, once among Moscow's biggest revenue streams, collapsed. European companies left the Russian market in waves. Russian financial channels were restricted. Russia suddenly needed a new market, a new buyer, and a new source of imports. China stepped in aggressively. Chinese exports to Russia surged. Chinese vehicles flooded the Russian market. Machinery, electronics, consumer goods, industrial equipment, all of it began flowing into Russia at much higher volumes. Russian oil, gas, and raw materials flowed in the other direction. But here is the crucial point. This is not a relationship between equals. It may look like a strategic axis, but economically, the balance is wildly uneven. Russia's nominal GDP sits at around $2.1 trillion. China's is above 21 trillion. That means China's economy is roughly 10 times larger. China is Russia's most important economic partner. Russia, by contrast, is only a secondary player in China's much larger global trade network. Russia depends on China for critical imports, technology substitutes, and market access. China does not depend on Russia in the same existential way, and that imbalance is the source of nearly every major tension in the relationship. Now let's talk about the third pillar, the personal bond between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. This part is real, and it matters more than many analysts are comfortable admitting. Xi has described Putin as his closest friend on the international stage. Over the years, the two have met dozens of times. They have held informal gatherings, celebrated birthdays, exchanged highly symbolic gifts, and built an image of personal trust that goes beyond ordinary state protocol. These were not just formal summits. They cultivated a personal rapport designed to reinforce the broader political relationship. Even on the third anniversary of the Ukraine war, Putin reportedly called Xi personally to reaffirm his commitment to the partnership. Beijing did not publicly shift away. It stayed aligned. So yes, the personal chemistry is real. It has helped stabilize the relationship. But even strong personal ties cannot eliminate structural tensions forever. And those tensions are now becoming impossible to ignore. The first major fault line is energy, specifically the gas price war surrounding the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. For Russia, this project is not just another infrastructure plan. It is a strategic necessity. After losing much of the European gas market, Moscow desperately needs to redirect more energy exports to Asia. Power of Siberia 2, a massive proposed pipeline running from western Siberia through Mongolia into northern China, is supposed to help solve that problem. It could carry up to 50 billion cubic meters of gas a year. On paper, it looks like a win for both sides. Russia replaces lost European demand. China secures discounted long-term energy. But in reality, the negotiations revealed who holds the leverage. For years, China refused to fully commit, not because it didn't want the gas, but because it understood Russia had few alternatives. Beijing reportedly pushed for gas prices close to domestic Russian rates, dramatically below what it had paid under previous arrangements. For Moscow, that was humiliating. Russia needed the deal far more than China did, and Beijing knew it. When an agreement in principle finally seemed to move forward, many headlines presented it as a diplomatic breakthrough. But the fine print told a different story. There was still no fully clear pricing structure, no final financing certainty, and no short-term relief for Russia. Even if everything moved smoothly, construction would take years, and full capacity would take even longer. In other words, the project is not a quick rescue for Russia. It is a long, slow, discounted lifeline controlled largely by Chinese leverage. And this gets to the heart of the matter. In a genuine alliance between equals, one side does not exploit the other's desperation this aggressively, but that is exactly what appears to be happening. Russia needs revenue. China wants cheap energy. Russia lost its European customers. China is in the driver's seat. That is not strategic parity. That is asymmetric dependence. The second major fault line is finance, especially the sanctions and banking standoff. When Western governments began threatening secondary sanctions on Chinese firms helping Russia too openly, Beijing adjusted. It did not do so with loud declarations or public criticism, but quietly through the banking system. Chinese banks began tightening compliance measures. Transactions involving Russian entities became more complicated. Payments were delayed or frozen. Russian companies found themselves suddenly unable to move money as smoothly through Chinese channels as they had expected. From Moscow's point of view, this was infuriating. Russia had leaned on China as its sanctions-proof economic partner. But when the pressure from the United States and Europe intensified, China prioritized protecting its own access to the global financial system. And from Beijing's perspective, that was rational. China wants to support Russia enough to keep the partnership alive, but not so much that it invites devastating financial retaliation from the West. So Beijing has tried to play both sides. It helps Russia, but carefully. It supplies support, but with limits. It talks about peace while still preserving strategic ties. That balancing act may make sense for China, but for Russia, it creates distrust. Because when you are isolated, desperate, and cut off from the West, partial support can feel dangerously close to unreliable support. The third major fault line may be the most explosive of all: espionage. Because nothing destroys strategic trust like the knowledge that your so-called partner is spying on you. Yet that is exactly what evidence has pointed toward. Russian cybersecurity investigations identified sophisticated hacking campaigns targeting Russian government agencies and technology contractors, and the tools used reportedly carried signatures linked to Chinese state-associated cyber actors. Malware, phishing operations, document-laced intrusions, covert data extraction. The pattern pointed toward intelligence collection inside Russian systems. Not symbolic spying, not random intrusions. Strategic intelligence gathering aimed at the inner machinery of the Russian state. And then came the more damaging signal: reported internal concerns from within Russia's own security apparatus about Chinese industrial espionage. If Russia's internal services are formally warning about Chinese efforts to steal military and defense-related technology, that changes the meaning of the relationship entirely, because states do not spy like that on true trusted equals without consequences. When China conducts cyber intelligence operations inside Russian-linked targets, it reveals something fundamental. Beijing may value the partnership, but it still sees Russia as a target, a source of exploitable information, and perhaps even a vulnerable junior player whose systems are fair game. Russia knows that, and once that realization sinks into a political security establishment, trust does not fully recover. The fourth fault line is territorial symbolism, and in geopolitics, symbolism matters. In 2023, China released an official map that appeared to depict Bolshoi Ussuriski Island, or Heixiazi Island, as entirely Chinese territory. The problem is that under the 2008 agreement, the island is shared. Russia controls one part, China controls the other. That arrangement is not trivial. The island sits at a strategically sensitive river junction that matters for navigation and regional access near one of Russia's key eastern cities. Moscow objected. Beijing downplayed it. But sovereign governments do not casually mislabel strategically important land on official state maps by accident. When borders begin reappearing differently on maps, it is often a sign that old ambitions have not disappeared. That may seem like a small issue compared to pipelines and war, but maps are how power starts imagining the future. The fifth major fault line is Central Asia. This may be one of the most important long-term pressure points in the entire relationship. Russia has historically treated Central Asia as its near abroad, its inherited sphere of influence, the geopolitical backyard it expects to shape. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, these are regions where Moscow has long wanted primacy. But China has steadily expanded its influence there through infrastructure, investment, pipelines, trade routes, rail projects, and the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing does not always send soldiers. It sends capital, roads, energy corridors, and economic dependency. And over time, that can be just as powerful. So now both Russia and China are deeply active in the same strategic region, but in different ways and with different ambitions. Russia wants political and security dominance. China wants economic and logistical dominance. The problem is that over the long run, those ambitions will increasingly overlap. Great powers rarely share the same geopolitical neighborhood forever without friction. Today, there is no open clash, but the structural rivalry is there, and it is growing. The sixth and deepest fault line is the widening inequality between the two countries. This is the issue beneath all the others. China's economy keeps expanding. Its industrial capacity continues to grow. Its technology base is more advanced and more diversified. Its manufacturing scale is immense. Russia, by contrast, is increasingly boxed into a narrower role. It exports raw materials, energy, metals, timber, and commodities. China exports finished goods, vehicles, electronics, machinery, industrial products, and consumer technology. One side is supplying the ground beneath its feet. The other is supplying the products of a modern industrial superpower. That is not an equal partnership. That is the architecture of dependency. The war in Ukraine accelerated this trend. Russia became more isolated. China became more valuable. Russian imports from China surged. Russian dependence rose. The leverage shifted further toward Beijing. And this is where the long-term danger lies for Moscow. If the economic gap keeps widening, and all signs suggest it will, then Russia's ability to negotiate from strength will continue shrinking. At some point, the relationship stops looking like a great power partnership and starts looking like a hierarchical arrangement in which one side manages the other. Now, to be clear, this alliance is not collapsing tomorrow. It still holds. Both capitals still need it for now. They still share strategic reasons to cooperate. They still oppose Western pressure. They still gain from the partnership in important ways. They still stage summits, issue declarations, and sign memorandums. And there is another factor complicating all of this: uncertainty in the broader global environment, changes in U.S. policy, fractures in transatlantic unity, tariff wars, sanctions calculations. All of these variables give both Beijing and Moscow reasons to preserve the relationship, at least for the near term. China still sees strategic insurance in keeping Russia close. Russia still sees strategic survival in leaning on China. But the real question serious analysts should be asking is not whether the alliance survives today. The real question is whether the structural forces pulling Russia and China apart will eventually become stronger than the forces holding them together. And based on everything we have just laid out, the answer is yes, that is entirely possible. Maybe not immediately, maybe not dramatically, but gradually, strategically, and perhaps sooner than many expect. Think about the scenario that worries long-term strategists most. China keeps rising, Russia stagnates or weakens further under sanctions, war costs, demographic strain, and overdependence on commodities. The global energy transition reduces demand for the very exports Russia relies on most. Chinese technology overtakes Russian military hardware in areas where Russia once had prestige. Beijing grows less reliant on Moscow, while Moscow grows more reliant on Beijing. If that happens, the balance changes irreversibly. China would have every reason to pursue its interests in Central Asia, the Arctic, and the Russian Far East with less and less regard for Russian sensitivities. And inside Russia, the awareness appears to be growing. The pipeline humiliation, the frozen payments, the sanctions hesitation, the cyber intrusions, the map signals, the competition in Central Asia, none of these alone breaks the relationship, but together they form a pattern that suggests Russia is not dealing with an equal ally, but with a more powerful neighbor that is willing to cooperate, exploit, pressure, and collect intelligence all at the same time. That is why this story matters so much, because in geopolitics, there are no permanent friendships, only converging interests. Right now, Russia and China still share enough interests to remain close. But interests evolve, power shifts, economic realities change. And when they do, the central question of the next era may become this: what happens when China no longer needs Russia in the way it does today? That is a question the world does not yet have an answer to, but it is exactly the kind of question we need to keep asking, because the future of this relationship could shape the future of the global order itself. And that is why we will keep following it here on Daily Brief. From the power of Siberia negotiations to Chinese cyber activity, from Central Asian competition to the next carefully choreographed summit between Xi and Putin. We will keep bringing you the real story beneath the headlines. If you found this deep dive geopolitical analysis valuable, make sure you subscribe to BCC News, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who wants to understand what is really happening between Russia and China. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think this alliance will hold, or are we watching the early stages of a historic geopolitical split? The world is changing fast, the power balance is shifting, and the cracks are there for anyone willing to look closely. And now you know where to look.